We're delighted to have brought together an exciting panel of speakers today to debate one of the most influential books in policy circles in recent times, The Spirit Level, Why More Equal Societies Almost Always Do Better. That book struck a chord across the political divide. It's been quoted not just by Labour politicians, who you might expect to be in sympathy with its views, but also by Liberal Democrats, indeed by David Cameron himself. So it struck a chord across the political divide as tough times turned minds to a re-evaluation of economic and social policy. And we thought about why it was that we've not been able to make the progress on inequality we wanted to, what the impact of that is. The Spirit Level, as you all know, argues that inequality is not just bad for those at the bottom of the social ladder, but affects everyone across the board. Among the rich countries of the world, states with less inequality in incomes perform better on a broad range of social indicators. The authors argue that far from pursuing ever greater per capita GDP, countries should concentrate on reducing the gap between the richest and the poorest in their societies, or countries in the rich world. But, as I'm sure you also all know, a recent report by the think tank Policy Exchange, Beware False Prophets, has raised a whole set of issues and concerns over the Spirit Level statistical methods and evidential underpinning. And so, in the spirit of open dialogue, we have brought both sides together today. So we're going to be hearing first from Peter Saunders and Christopher Snowdon, who are going to present their Policy Exchange work. And then Kate Pickett, Richard Wilkinson, authors of The Spirit Level, are going to respond to that critique. And then we're going to open up and have a discussion, and we're going to finish at 2 o'clock. Now, just to say this finally, I'm sorry if this sounds pompous, but in my annual lecture last year, I talked about that kind of transcendent moment in debate when you get to the point where you agree about what it is that you disagree about. And although I know lots of people here have very firm views, indeed I understand that people have been rallied to come here and support the different sides. I'm asking you to join me, and indeed I'm asking the speakers to join me in that quest to see whether by 2 o'clock we've got a better idea about what it is that we agree, that we disagree about. And I'd much rather do that than to spend all our time trying to deduce what it is we say the other side says, which they don't actually say, which is 99% of political debate in my experience. So I hope we're all kind of together in that quest, so at least there'll be more clarity by 2 o'clock. So each side's going to have 15 minutes. I'm going to be quite strict about that, and that means that we should have a good 20 minutes for discussion. So first of all, can I ask you to welcome to present their critique of the Spirit Level, Peter Saunders and Christopher Snowdon.
Thanks very much. I'm not actually from the Policy Exchange. I'm an independent writer. I wrote a book called The Spirit Level Delusion, which came out a couple of months ago. But the Policy Exchange document does verify much of what I said in that book. Anyway, we understand that the basic idea of the Spirit Level is that economic growth no longer makes us happier or healthier, but reducing inequality does. One of the first graphs you see in the Spirit Level looks very much like this. It's appeared in several books. You may have seen it before. It shows happiness as measured in a survey against national income. And normally this is taken to mean that as societies grow wealthier, they become happier. Now, Wilkinson and Pickett put a slightly different slant on this, which is that they say that actually what happens is that as countries hit a certain level of wealth, they no longer get happier. It tapers off, it flattens off. And to a point, that is true. There is a fairly simple reason why it flattens off, which is the very top of the graph is 100%. So naturally, it's not going to keep going beyond that point. But having got the happiness data out, you would expect them, for the premise of the book, to show us happiness against inequality and show us that the more equal societies are happier. This they never do, but if we look at how that would look, we can see that there is no correlation either way between happiness as measured in these surveys and income inequality. There is, however, and we don't see this graph either, there is still, this is from the same data set, but there is, for the richest countries, which are the focus of the Spirit Level, there is still a very clear correlation actually between national income and happiness. Even at a very high level of economic development, it seems that societies do benefit from greater income. Now, of course, it's not all about happiness surveys. That's just one indicator. We would look for an objective index of whether a society is doing better, how well-being is, whether the society is successful and happy. The quality of life index gives us a very good measure of that. This was published in 2005, and it takes 9 key criteria of what makes a successful country, puts them together. I've plotted this on a graph again against inequality to see if the more equal societies fare better under the quality of life, and again, there isn't a correlation either way, really. Very, very slight line going up there, but no statistically significant correlation. But, as I'm sure Kate and Richard are going to tell you in a few minutes, the spirit level is based on a mountain of hundreds of peer-reviewed journals. And yes, there are over 300 sources. In the spirit level, we've got references to newspaper articles, we've got references to the core data from the UN and the Office of National Statistics and so on. We've got references indeed to peer-reviewed journals saying that there are social gradients to health, which of course there are. We've got references to peer-reviewed journals saying that this problem's getting worse, this problem's getting better. What there isn't is a significant body of peer-reviewed research saying that inequality in and of itself is the cause of all these problems. And the mountain of evidence is not that. It's a number of hundreds of references, all of which are applicable, but the key assumption that inequality itself is the cause and not income or other factors, that is not a mainstream idea, and do not believe that it is. There is one exception where there is a significant scientific literature, and that is with life expectancy and inequality, and this is based over the last 2 or 3 decades. But even here, a great deal of that literature disagrees with the theory that inequality is linked to life expectancy. And indeed, that evidence has got weaker over time. As early as 2002, sorry, I was going to read that out, but never mind. As early as 2002, British Medical Journal editorial said that now that good data on income inequality have become available for 16 Western industrialized countries, the association between income inequality and life expectancy has disappeared. A year earlier, Professor Angus Ding of Princeton University said, although there are many puzzles that remain, I conclude that there is no direct link from income inequality to ill health. Individuals are no more likely to die if they live in more unequal places. And only last year, in the Oxford Handbook of Economic Inequality, they concluded that the preponderance of evidence suggests that the relationship between income inequality and health is either non-existent or too fragile to show up in a robustly estimated panel specification. The best cross-national studies now uniformly fail to find a statistically reliable relationship between economic inequality and longevity. So how then does the spirit level manage to make such a persuasive case to the contrary? One answer, I think, lies in the selection of data. This is how they show income inequality against life expectancy in the spirit level. But here, as elsewhere in the book, we are led to believe that we are looking at all the rich countries that have the relevant data. But it's not true. If Portugal, which is the poorest country in the spirit level, if Portugal is wealthy enough to no longer benefit from economic growth and therefore to be included in this list, then we should also see the Czech Republic, South Korea, Slovenia, and Hong Kong. None of those countries are even mentioned in the spirit level. Also, I'd say that this data comes from a UN report from 2004. Elsewhere in the spirit level, used the 2006 UN report. If we look at the figures from the 2006 report and show the full range of countries, then we see that the graph changes dramatically, with modest correlation in the other direction. And just to show that it's not me doing cherry picking, this is the data from the most recent 2009 report. And you can see, in fact, that Sweden's been overtaken by a number of less equal countries. You can see that Denmark is right down at the bottom, along with 2 other egalitarian societies. Give you one more example. This is obesity as shown in the spirit level. I think even the casual reader can see that this line going up is being drawn very much by the USA at the top and Japan down there at the bottom. That Greek figure, incidentally, is an anomalous figure from a rogue study. Other larger studies have shown that obesity in Greece is actually very much within the EU average. If we correct that Greek figure and show the other countries, and you'll notice there's not even Singapore is on this particular graph, you can see again it flatlines, and the evidence about obesity is patchy, but basically there is no correlation whichever figures you look at. What you can see, interestingly, I think in this graph, is if you include the other Asian societies, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Korea, you can see that Japan hasn't got a low rate of obesity because of the distribution of wealth. It's almost certainly something to do with factors that are unique to Asian societies, very likely diet and genetics. And I will leave you with this quote from Professor John Kay. This is in his review of the spirit level, while Peter comes up to talk to you.
And you're only halfway through. Kay makes the point about outliers, and I want to focus on 3 of the technical problems with the regression diagrams that you find scattered throughout the spirit level, and the first of them has to do with the problem of outliers. This is the graph showing the relationship between inequality and homicide rate. Now you'll see that virtually all the countries are clustered, no matter whether they're equal or unequal, are clustered on a homicide rate of between about 10 and 20 per 100,000 population. And there's one that stands out way, way above at about 60 homicides per 100,000, which is the USA. The most basic rule of regression analysis is that you take out your outliers and you see what is left. You've got 23 cases there. On 22 of them, the question is there a relationship between inequality and homicide? Answer, no, there isn't. That's with the USA taken out, and you see the key figure is the probability figure, 0.0159. You need to get below 0.05 for a statistically significant association. Statistical significance disappears. I'd also draw your attention to the quote that I've put up there, which is one of the most absurd propositions to find in the whole book, which says if Britain became as equal as Scandinavian countries, homicide rates could fall by 75%. Look at Sweden on that graph. I don't know if you can make it out. There's Sweden. Here's the UK. We've actually got a lower homicide rate than Sweden. The reason that they predict that Britain could reduce its homicide rate by 3/4 if we had Swedish levels of income is they're predicting it off their regression line. The regression line tells them that the UK is way up there. But actually, it's not. It's not. It's down among all the other countries. The only reason they've got that regression line showing the upward slope is because of the United States. You don't just find this on homicide. You find it, for example, on childhood obesity. You find it throughout the spirit level. This reliance on just 1 or 2 outliers to give you an apparent association when there's no association when you take the outliers out. Again, USA is the outlier on child obesity. Take it out. Look at the P, 0.129. Well above the 0.05s that we're looking for. It's not significant. This time it's Japan is the outlier on life expectancy. It may be all that oily fish they eat, I don't know, but take Japan out. We look at the P, 0.148, not significant. So that's the first problem, is that they disregard outliers. I have to tell you, I used to teach research methods when I was an academic at the University of Sussex. I used to teach second-year students research methods. If they'd given me graphs like that, I'd have failed them. And so would anybody that knows anything about social statistics. This is basic rules of regression analysis. The second problem is that you have to start looking, the authors of the spirit level insist that culture and history are not important. It's all being driven by income inequality. Now we know, if all that book had said was, Scandinavia is different from the Anglo countries on a whole range of indicators, nobody would pay any attention. We've known that for donkey's years. That's not the question. What they're saying is Scandinavia is different from the Anglo countries because of their levels of income inequality. Now, the only way you can test for that is to see when you take Scandinavia out or the Anglo countries out of these graphs, does the pattern still remain among all the other countries? Or is it that there's something culturally and historically specific about the Anglo countries and the Scandinavian countries which is generating these differences between them, and not the fact of their income distribution that's generating the differences? Well, here's one example, an obvious example, which is on women's status. On the left-hand side, you've got the graph that you're given in the spirit level. You'll see that that little knot of countries on the top left quadrant of that graph are the 4 Scandinavian countries. Take the 4 Scandinavian countries out. There's a good reason why Scandinavian countries perform well on this index of women's status. The index is about how many women MPs you've got and so on. Scandinavian countries have developed deliberate policies to increase the number of women MPs. Take the Scandinavian countries out, no association, P 0.503. The association's completely collapsed without the 4 Scandinavian countries. There is no association between inequality and women's status. The point is that women's status is higher in Scandinavia, not that it's higher in more equal countries. Find the same thing again. They use patents to say that more equal countries are more innovative. Nonsense, take out the Scandinavian countries, which do appear to be more innovative, and the relationship collapses. I've actually put this graph in as well, because those of you who are familiar with regression models will see on that graph that it's not even a linear relationship. I mean, the technical aside, there's a requirement on regression analysis that there be equality of variances down the regression line. That requirement is completely busted in that graph and in a number of the other ones. You can't even fit a straight line to those data points, in other words. But in the spirit level, they do. And teenage births, this time, we know that the Anglo countries have a high problem of teenage births. We know the Scandinavians deal with this far better than we do. Question, what about all the other countries? If you take them out, again, is it inequality that's driving it? Answer, no, it's not. Look at the P level, 0.16, it's collapsed. I haven't got time to go through this. In the book, I try to set out why it is that the Anglo countries and the Scandinavian countries differ on these things, and it has to do with deep sociological and historical issues about homogeneity, about their traditions, about the way in which they developed, about their immigration, about their patterns of intermarriage and so on. These are sociological explanations for a sociological problem. It's nothing to do with their level of income inequality. Finally, third problem with these graphs is that not once in this book do they look at a relationship between 2 variables and then say, I wonder if that relationship still holds up when we add a third variable. Basic elementary process in social analysis. Go back to, it becomes a particular problem on the US data. They look at US states. Here we've got the homicide rate in American states. What you find is that the left-hand graph is the one in the spirit level. Look at the R-square, that tells you the strength of the relationship. Look at the degree to which the points are all close to the line. That's the key thing. That's what the R-square is measuring, of 0.269. But the trouble is that a lot of the most unequal states in America are also the states that have the highest black population. Sorry, I'm getting a bit dry. Have the highest black population. So the graph on the right is the same thing, homicide rates in American states by the proportion of African Americans in each state. And what you find is that it's twice as strong, more than twice as strong. Ethnicity predicts homicide in American states twice as well as income inequality does. So the obvious thing then is to say, well, we've got to control for ethnicity. And when you control for ethnicity, what you find is you get a good model. If I put in ethnicity and income inequality, and whether it's a deep south state or not, you get a good model fit. But the only one of those 3 indicators I need to predict the homicide rate in the American state is ethnicity. I need to know what's the proportion of African Americans in the population. That gives me my prediction of the homicide rate. The other 2 factors fail to achieve significance. Even more so with infant mortality. Here we go again. When you control for ethnicity, what you find is that the proportion of African Americans in the American state is 18 times more powerful in predicting the infant mortality rate of that state than the income distribution is. Income distribution just ceases to be significant. It's been found by other studies. And how do the authors of the spirit level respond to this? They respond by saying, I'm a racist for wanting to control for ethnicity. The data show that what's driving these American data is ethnicity. The response of the authors is to say it's a racist slur to try to control for ethnicity. Basically, the summary is that in my book, I look at 20 of their correlations, the international and the American data. I look at 20 of their correlations in detail. 14 of them just fall straight over because of the factors I've been talking about. Another 5 have some partial validity but are better explained by some other factor. One of them, just one of them, stands up, which is the international infant mortality data. And then I found Chris Snowdon's book. We met after we both published our books, and Chris Snowdon's book has an excellent section in it explaining why the infant mortality data are wrong.
Thank you. Okay, I should apologise because I did wrongly introduce Christopher Snowdon. He's not from Policy Exchange, as he said. He's the author of The Spirit Level Delusion, which you can buy outside along with copies of The Spirit Level. So can I ask you now to welcome our respondents, Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson. I won't take this off your time.
Thank you. I'm going to leave most of the answers on the data points to Kate. I want to try and explain to you what we were doing in this book. We were not trying to show you the most dramatic relationships that other researchers have produced. There are lots of them. There must be 40 or 50 papers on homicide. Much more dramatic relationships than we were showing in our book. There's one of them. Here's another. That's American states with Canadian provinces on the end. Tenfold differences. There are just so many of these. This is school bullying, not from us, but someone else. We show much weaker relationships on all these things. We were not trying just to show you how awful inequality was. This is a relationship between health in 528 cities, death rates in relation to income. Much more dramatic than anything we show in our book. A similar graph amongst the American states, looking at health of working-age men, death rates of working-age men in relation to inequality, with the Canadian provinces added on the end. Much harder to make the kind of criticism that's been made of what we show in our book. What we were trying to do in our book was to produce a theory of problems with social gradients. We do not deal with happiness and things like that. Happiness is not stronger at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Most of our data is things that have very hard outcomes, not subjective things like happiness. And the big problems with subjective variables internationally, for instance, self-reported health internationally is inversely related to death rates. Self-reported health is worse where death rates are higher. So real problems with that. Or changes over time in health. So we were not trying to just pick out the most impressive relationships. What we were doing was trying to take the countries up here on this curve of national income per person in relation to life expectancy. We didn't, as has been suggested, choose the countries that were in or out. There are different ways of converting currencies to common dollars to produce graphs like this. We use data on using the ATLAS method, which is the method the World Bank uses to classify countries as high, medium, or low income. And on that basis, we absolutely stuck to our rule of the 50 richest countries according to that data. And we looked just at them. What we were trying to do was to see whether all these relationships held up in that setting. We picked our countries, we took an easily available measure of income distribution, though it doesn't matter much which, and then we went through whatever the data showed, and whatever the outcome measures, whether there were outliers or not, we didn't remove them. Absolutely no choice at all. There were the countries, this was the inequality measure, and then the data come what may. And, you know, we were specifically not saying, well, this is an outlier, that's not, spoils our relationship, so we'll remove it. But I want to go on with this. It was Michael Marmot some time ago, the real big change in our understanding of population health and social inequalities in health has been the importance of psychosocial mediation. Your health isn't bad just because you're in poorer physical circumstances, it's bad because you feel chronically stressed. Things like depression and anxiety and feelings of helplessness and all that. And we know a lot now about how chronic stress works. But it seemed to me implausible that chronic stress could have a major influence on death rates and not show up anywhere else. And yet I knew there was work from a number of sources showing, for instance, that health inequalities, that health is worse in more unequal societies. 200 papers. Of the ones that look at large areas, you find that only 6% of them show no relationship. All the others show some relationship. But you see, this is the relationship just amongst the countries we chose, amongst the 50 richest, for which there was good income distribution data. National income per person and life expectancy, absolutely no relationship. But within every country, there is this extraordinary social gradient, which tells us that we're dealing with relative income within our societies, or social status, social position. And actually, to remove the black population in the American states from the calculations is like saying, let's, when considering inequality, remove the manual working population, or something like that. You know, it's really not plausible. Kate will deal with that in more detail. But this is the relationship when you put all these things together. It's such a tight correlation. This is a correlation between an index where all those things on the left are weighted equally. And they are all problems that are more common at the bottom of the scale. We accept that there are lots of issues which go the other way, that are more common at the top of the scale, which don't have this pattern. We aren't trying to say everything is worse in more unequal societies. It's a theory of a social gradient. And if you look at the social gradient in so many of our social problems, do you put it down to just social mobility? If so, how do you explain why violence is 10 times as high in one country as another, or health is much worse in these more unequal countries on the data that they haven't criticized at all because they haven't looked at it? The social gradients, you can't get these social gradients just from sorting. It doesn't explain why these problems become so much more common in more unequal societies, nor are they related to material circumstances, because as I showed you in this graph, the whole society getting richer doesn't make any difference. But they are related to social position, social status, relative issues, and all we do is say, what happens when you make these differences bigger between people at the bottom and the top of the social hierarchy? We have a consistent theory behind all this work, and I think there is no coherent theory at all in the opposition. It is just picking off data points because they don't like the particular evidence we showed, which is far from being the best evidence on any of these relationships.
Good afternoon. What do I do now?
Straight on to,
Okay, it has. I just want to reinforce, I think, what Richard's already mentioned, and indeed Christopher mentioned earlier, that all of the work we present in the Spirit level has been peer-reviewed, and not only the research that we publish, but our research proposals are always peer-reviewed. And we will be publishing detailed rebuttals online on Monday to the report by Saunders from the Policy Exchange, to Snowdon's report, and one to the Taxpayers Alliance as well. I haven't got time to deal with every single point they've made today, so I'll just pick a few, but those will be available online. I'm going to start with social mobility, and I'm going to start with that because Saunders in his book, when he discusses our analysis of social mobility and inequality, says he's saving the worst until the last. Here's the graph that we presented in the Spirit level. He has problems with this in sort of three areas, and one is to do with the measure that's used. He quotes, actually misquotes, a report by Dr. Joe Blandon from the London School of Economics, and says that she says there is a lot of uncertainty about these kinds of measurements, a lot of uncertainty about the UK. In fact, Blandon was reporting somebody else as saying that, and she concludes in her report that you can measure intergenerational mobility, you can produce comparable measures over time, and her preferred measure is the measure of intergenerational income mobility, which we use here. The second criticism that Saunders makes of this particular analysis is that we shouldn't do a regression analysis here. We shouldn't be putting a line here because we have two very separate groups of countries. Actually, I teach research methods too, and regression analysis is pretty robust to the assumptions you make about it. But it would be nice, wouldn't it, if there were more countries to look at. When we published the Spirit level, there were only data for these 8 countries. But in that same report by Dr. Blandon, misquoted by Saunders, there's actually some interesting new data. I think perhaps he didn't read it thoroughly, so I have brought a copy. Data are provided on 3 new countries. So new data have come out since we did our work. They fill in the line. So the gap problem no longer applies, and there's a statistically significant association between social mobility and inequality. In fact, Blandon also has in her report a table, Table 5. She reports on associations between several different measures of inequality and several different measures of social mobility. And she concludes that there are strong relationships. In fact, she says, and I assure you this is an accurate quote, there is the expected relationship between inequality and mobility. The relationship between mobility and poverty isn't driving it. Inequality at the top is important as well. As well as teaching research methods, I teach critical appraisal. If one of my students misused a source, they would fail too, but none of my students would. Snowdon poses a series of 20 questions to us. They're posted on his website, and our replies will be on ours. One of the questions he asks is, do you accept that the correlation between inequality and trust depends entirely on the Nordic countries? Well, no, we don't. Here it is without the Nordic countries, and even Saunders accepts that this relationship holds with the Nordic countries out. He adds poorer countries in to show that average wealth matters as well. Well, of course it does, if we're looking at poorer countries. But this issue of what data are in and what data are out is a serious point. As Richard said, we always present the same set of countries if we have outcome data for them. To make the relationship between inequality and women's status go away, Saunders removes the Nordic countries. Japan is actually more of an outlier further off the trend line. Take that out, as he would suggest we ought to do, the relationship reappears again. It's significant again. Take Nordics out, the relationship between foreign aid and inequality goes away. Again, Japan is more of an outlier. Take it out, as he suggests we should, the relationship appears significant again. Snowdon says, why don't we include Singapore in our mental illness data? We don't in our peer-reviewed work because we don't think the surveys of high enough quality. Put it in, it's a massive outlier. The relationship is still significant. For obesity, take the USA out, the relationship disappears. Take Greece out, it comes back in again. Look at it for women, it's there anyway, whether the USA is in or out. We also try to do work that sort of looks at the coherence of relationships. If obesity is higher in more unequal countries, calorie consumption ought to be as well. It is, and we showed that in a paper in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health. The link between inequality and education is quite weak, so we've looked at it again in 2006. It's still there. We show it for science literacy as well as for maths and reading. And again, looking at coherence, if educational achievement is poor, other measures ought to be as well, and we find that there are fewer kids in further education in more unequal countries. To get rid of the relationship between teen births and inequality, Saunders has to remove both the Anglo-speaking countries and the Nordic countries. And yet, if you look at the Anglo-speaking countries alone, inequality explains why one has a worse level of teenage births than the other. For conflict, the Nordics come out. So it's in, out. USA's in, USA's out. Japan's in, Japan's out. The Nordics are out, turn them all around, shake them all about. You know, it's a bit hokey-cokey, or maybe jiggery-pokey. I want to move on to discuss a particular kind of study of income inequality and health. And it is true that this is the area where there has been the most research, and it has been a very contentious area of research for some time. You've been told about a couple of studies from the early 2000s casting doubt on this relationship. More up-to-date studies are much more clear. In particular, there are studies now that look at hundreds and thousands and millions of people, control for their own individual income or education, and look at the effect of inequality on the health of those people, net of their own socioeconomic status. Recently, one of those studies was published in the British Medical Journal. It included 60 million people, and it shows a significant contextual effect. There are also studies now, a review of studies of those multi-level kinds of studies, and they show a consistent impact of inequality on health. 2 minutes. Thanks. Quickly on to time trends. Snowdon asks, why didn't we mention that the homicide rate in 2008 was the lowest ever? Because we wrote the book in 2007, and those data were published in 2010. But here are homicide rates in the US over time, and a bottom-sensitive measure of income inequality, and you can see they track quite nicely. Multi-level studies show that you actually need to measure a lag between change in inequality and health, but it's there. And Clark West and colleagues have recently shown that US states with the highest rises in income inequality have had the lowest rises in life expectancy. Talking about third variables, what you should control for or what you should not, epidemiologists know that you don't just throw something carelessly into a model, because if it's on the causal pathway between one thing and another, if it attenuates the relationship, that's because it's working through it rather than being an alternative explanation. I think I'll skip these two, but recently there have been two very sensitive mediation analyses showing that income inequality affects homicides, partially working through trust, not the other way around, and inequality affects healthy life expectancy, partially working through trust and not the other way around. And here, on the point of whether or not it's ethnic heterogeneity that matters, homicide is related to inequality among both southern and northern men, even when inequality is measured just among white males. Two recent studies update the issue on ethnic heterogeneity and health. They suggest that both within US states and internationally, income inequality is significantly related to health, even after including a measure of ethnic heterogeneity. And indeed, one of those authors says that the recent skepticism articulated by scholars in regard to the robustness of income inequality and health relationships should be reconsidered. One last point. We are talking about human suffering here. 25% of Americans with mental health problems in any given year. Child well-being in the UK, the lowest of anywhere in Western Europe. So we are talking about important problems. Saunders suggests in his policy exchange pamphlet that sociology has been remarkably inept at providing us with the evidence and tools to create a better society. Epidemiology has done rather better. It's been a privilege to work with Richard on these analyses and also to draw on the work of academics across a range of disciplines and countries who have also produced strong evidence of the effect of inequality on a whole range of health and social problems. So truly I stand on the shoulders of giants when I commend our work to you and stand up for its robustness. We do believe that reductions in inequality would benefit almost everybody, all of us here in this room, even those of us who prefer not to believe it. Thanks.